Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. I'm glad basically to follow up on Nathan and Rob. So Michelle asked, like, what's the mechanism? Why, like, the use of plow 7,000 years ago makes women less likely to work today, or pick your favorite exotic historical event or geographic characteristic and see that it correlates with today's outcomes. And so the question is, like, why on earth? Because we believe it does, and then we basically convince each other that the correlations are there, but why? Here's the answer. Folklore. No, I'm very serious. If either you believe it's the oral tradition that transmits information, or it is the genes, or it's the water and the food that we eat. Basically, these are the transmission mechanisms that we have in mind. We don't know much about genes. We're learning fast. We don't know much about food. How does it cause you to think certain things? But today I'm going to show you that oral traditions is why we believe social norms are transmitted over long periods of time. So if you want to think about change, if you want to think about transmission, this is your best bet. Okay, I know I make grandiose statements, but it's okay. So, how would you like to show this in a very systematic way? World value surveys for pre-industrial societies. Then, all these questions about transmission and change and persistence would be very nicely answered, at least quantitatively, because you would have what your great ancestor answered in the same question today, in 1500, in 1000 BC, and then you can see what things are persistent and when things are changed, and then you can think before and after about historical events and things like that. So we are not there yet. I'm going to show you how we could possibly go there. And there is economic and social characteristics of pre-industrial societies. We would like to know much more about those. We have been beating the same data set, which is basically the ethnographic record from the ethnographic atlas. It's a fantastic resource, but also, unique and very noisy, and it has all the problems and all the benefits. So if we were to be able to go to somehow leverage more information about the history of these groups, we could get an additional proxy for the same things that we are measuring in the ethnographic atlas. We would recover groups that are not in the ethnographic atlas and also reconstruct traits that the ethnographers did not bother to put down in a systematic way. Okay, great. How do we do all these things? Okay, so my answer is basically try to look at the oral tradition of a group, look at the folklore. So there is a recent understanding among Nobel laureates in economics that narratives matter. Now take narratives at the society level, and you hit oral traditions. So what is a folklore? Is collection of fictional stories, myths, jokes, proverbs, songs, tales, legends, folk dances, and initiation rituals. It is really a description of culture. It is informally taught and passed across generations, both horizontally and vertically, usually not taught at school. It is also an academic discipline. It's hybrid. It lives in the humanities and the social sciences because they work with text and they get to ask questions about, that social scientists would care about. 2 minutes to get you a crash course in folklore. Begins in early 19th century, industrialization and urbanization takes strides in Europe. There are guys that feel that the old lifestyle is going away very quickly. So how are we going to make things, to basically keep tradition alive by just writing down? And so this is what they do. So the Grimm brothers are kind of the godfathers of this discipline. They have the first collection of fairy tales in 1812. So there is a large wave of academics or semi-academics going around, collecting stories, putting them down, and publishing them. So an important advance in the early 20th century is, okay, fine, we have all these books, we have all these tales, legends, and stories. Now, how do we make sense of those? So they start thinking about motifs. So think of a motif as a very short and pithy abstract of a tale. So they start thinking about motifs seriously. Late 20th century, folklorists they are now postmodernism goes through humanities, which means that you cannot compare anything. You cannot compare text. You cannot compare narrators. You cannot like a different story is told by the same guy at 12 o'clock versus 7 p.m. So basically, stop comparing. It's like telling to economists, don't compare GDP per capita, which would be very bad for economists. But anyhow, folklore, comparative mythology, if you wish, which is basically the field in folklore that compares oral traditions, goes into the back burner. We're going to stay comparative mythologies today. What are we doing? Our hero is the famous folklorist and anthropologist. He's a curator at the Museum of Anthropology in St. Petersburg, Yuri Bereskin. So what this guy has done, he's done something amazing. He basically has put together, he's about 80 years old and he keeps on working hard. He did his PhD in oral traditions among Native American Indians, among Native Indigenous American, America as a continent. And then he basically expanded his data set into covering the whole world. So what do we have basically? Matrix, 1,000 groups, about 2,500 motifs. A motif, I'm going to show you some examples, are very short descriptions of events, of characters doing something. And then 0-1, does this image, episode exist in the oral tradition of a given society or not? So many problems with this data set. I will not talk about those. I will talk about only the benefits. I'm sure we can talk about the problems a lot of time. So what are we going to do? We're going to do something very simple. First of all, I'm going to spend a few minutes to ask the question, does this data make any sense to start with? So I'm going to ask the question, does the geography that is depicted in the oral tradition, is it consistent with the location of these groups today? I'm going to tell you that, for several characteristics, there is a correspondence. Then I'm going to ask myself, I'm going to basically take these groups from folklore and match them to their ethnographic record. So then I will know who is a hunter-gatherer, who is a farmer, who is a herder. And then I'm going to ask, if you are a fisherman in the ethnographic record, do you talk more about fish, fishing, hooks, and things like that? So is there a correspondence between the images and the episodes of the folklore and the observed subsistence given from ethnographers? So then, what is the goal of this exercise? Is to show you that there is a correspondence. The oral tradition talks about things that ethnographers have also put down as being salient characteristics of these groups. So once I convince myself that there is a correspondence, I'm going to start asking questions for which we do not currently have an answer. For example, there are many famous conjectures in anthropology that make claims about certain types of subsistence and how they influence the culture of honor among pastoralists, the affluent society hypothesis by silence, Plow and the Bostrap hypothesis about the role of women. Take your favorite one, try to figure out whether there is something in the oral tradition that is consistent with the hypothesis that you are trying to explore. Finally, so my approach will be basically a dictionary-based approach. I'm going to be going through the motifs, and I'm going to be asking, does this motif talk about agriculture, fishing, kings? And I'm going to tell you where I'm drawing these words from. So when once I show you that there is a correspondence between the physical environment and the ethnographic record and the oral tradition, I'm going to test some hypotheses among social scientists regarding the extent of trade among centralized societies in the past. Why, this is basically, it's not even a hypothesis, we take it for granted. The problem is that we don't have trade data for ethnographic societies. I'm going to tell you how one could use the oral tradition to extract measures of trade. One would like to think about the culture of honor and violence, and whether, there are many more motifs on retaliation and revenge among pastoral societies. If you believe that there is this culture of honor, does it lurk somewhere in the oral tradition of the group? How about, family groups organized along extended family lines? Do they talk about family more often? How about leisure among foraging societies? Finally, in the last few minutes, and see, this is basically brand new and probably also will change, is thinking about, okay, you have the oral tradition. I believe that basically this is what our great-great-grandparents wanted to pass along. So it is the vehicle of transmission of norms, beliefs, and attitudes. So I'm not making any distinction for now across generations. So I'm going to ask at the end, what type of stories predict preferences that economists care about, like altruism, trust, and risk-taking? I'm going to show you how we do it. Okay, so this is what we have in mind. We have in mind something that has been going on for as long as humans have been around in more than a family, or even for a family. So it has been taking place among foraging societies to modern 21st century, and is likely to be around as long as we stick around as a society. Okay, so it's something that I have been doing also a lot. Okay, so let me spend a few minutes about what is a motif. Motif is a recurrent image, idea, or symbol that develops and explains a tale. It often takes the form an actor, an item, and an incident. So that's kind of usually how folklorists motivate what is a motif. There are two existing classifications of folklore. ATU is the most widely known. I'm not using it today. It's mostly Indo-European. I'm using Bereskin's classification, which is a global classification across 1,000 groups. How to think about these motifs? A rough split between cosmological and theological motifs that talk about, why we die, why there is sun, why there are diseases. These are, very important questions that early societies had to have an answer. Why earthquakes happen? Why there is thunderstorms? Maybe we know today, but a couple of 100 years ago or 500 years ago, probably we were punished by God. And another 50% is basically stories about, animals doing tricky things, adventures, heroes going around, and things like that. Okay, so here is basically a few motifs. A girl meets another, meets a powerful person, behaves herself in the right way and is successful. Another behaves in the wrong way and is punished. 160 societies would have a story that would boil down to something like this. Another one is a task giver is a king. A person who gives difficult tasks to the hero is a prominent figure in the social hierarchy. This is present in 220 groups. So think about it, like 2,600 of these little excerpts, like 2-3 liners, and how we make sense of those. So here's like the dead shake the earth. Earthquakes are produced by the dead who are in the underworld or during the earthquake. So the inhabitants of the lower world try to come out. That's 19 motifs there. Okay, so lots of material that Bereskin has consulted, about 6,000 references, books and journals. Not going to talk about those. Median group has basically has 10 books have been consulted, about 10 authors, published in 4 different languages. The median earliest publication is 1900. Okay, so I'm not going to tell you how a motif is constructed, but think about it in a given way. So that's a motif about someone losing an axe and then being offered subsequently a golden axe and a bronze axe and the silver axe and denying them, saying that mine was a wooden one, and eventually being rewarded for his honesty, being given all axes together. So this motif is present in these societies. So think that what we have 2,500 maps of basically dots that tell us where a story exists. So this is the particular one about the golden axe motif. I thought it was Greek because it's actually in the Aesop fables, and of course it's in Greece, but it's actually in many other parts of the world as well. Okay, the problems. These are the problems. And now, the data. Here's basically the dots tell you the indigenous societies that are sampled. So it's a pretty decent coverage, about 1,000 pre-industrial societies. A lot of action. Rob was talking about this Ute, Paviozzo, and they're like all there. And at the much finer level, it was his PhD. So it's always like the PhD is always the best part. And then he moves out. Fantastic work, but a lot of great coverage for the Americas. So there's the Americas. That's Africa. These are all indigenous societies. And that's now the number of motifs per group. We don't have a story of how to understand this number of motifs per group. It's how much they have been sampled, how much imaginative they are. So for now, think of it as how many images are there. So How we're going to do text analysis? Basically, it's very simple. Look for among predetermined list of words and look for specific words. What are the list of words that we're getting from? They come from ConceptNet. ConceptNet is like a knowledge graph. Basically, you go online, you punch in a word like fish. And then it gives you immediately the most closely related words to fish: hook, fishing, coast, waves, water. You can stop with you pick up a cutoff, and then you get these closest words. And then you have basically, for every word that you may imagine, you have its closest neighbors. So this is going to be the list of words from ConceptNet, and then a couple of dictionaries that are created by social psychologists, the Luke Dictionary and the MFD. Okay, so how we're doing this? This is the unobserved tails. This is Bereskin's CPU forming the motifs. This is where we come in, where we basically tag motifs, whether they fall into a given list of words or not, and then we count how many motifs does this oral tradition talk about earthquakes. How many motifs does it talk about kings and queens, and then we're going to tag a respondent as belonging to a given oral tradition. Okay, so 1 minute to show you that how the physical environment is reflected in the oral tradition of the group. So geographic characteristics, we know where they live more or less, as of today, of course, like mid-20th century. Does the current geographic environment is reflected on the type of motifs that they are talking about? So what type of geographic characteristics we think would be salient enough to register in the oral tradition of a group? Think about earthquakes. This came up. Like, must be salient. It is also, time varying. It freaks you out. So here's what we see. Groups further away from earthquake zones are much less likely to basically have a motif about earthquakes. How about other geographic features? Thunders. This is flash lightning density, like how often during the year there is flashes. Groups that live in high thunder striking zones, they have motifs, many more motifs about thunders. Guys that live in warmer places, they don't have motifs that talk about cold, frozen, snow, and things like that. I guess these are some correlations that to tell you that there is some. The smell test smells okay. How about you do more on crops? If you mention more rice and crop-related stuff from ConceptNet, if you live in places that have better suitability for agriculture. Okay, ethnographers meet 5 minutes. Ethnographers meet the folklorists, fishing motifs, hunting motifs, and pastoral motifs. Basically, this is the answer. Ethnographers tell you that these guys do more agriculture. They have many more motifs on crops. Ethnographers tell you that they do more on fishing. They have more motifs on fishing. Ethnographers tell you that they derive a larger share of subsistence from herding. They talk more about pastoralism. Okay. So I'm not going to tell you. I'm going to just take 1 minute to talk about the original affluent society hypothesis. That's a hypothesis by Salin, says that you should stop thinking of hunter-gatherers as working a lot. They actually work very little. Here is some data from few societies. They work on average 4 hours a day. Can we somehow shed some light to this question? Well, do hunting and gathering groups feature more motifs describing leisure? We have this entry from Luke, which basically is a bag of words, a list of words regarding leisure. Here's some words that are being tagged. Motifs are about celebration, dance, entertain, dream, fun, game, joke, sing, play, and relax. So these are like motifs that are some leisurely activity. And indeed, you see that hunting and gathering groups are more likely to have more motifs that are about leisure. And this is within continents, and this is now even comparing groups within countries. Okay, now I just want to show you the last bit that I finished doing yesterday, and I'm kind of excited about. So how are preferences and beliefs transmitted across generations? It is the stories that people tell, the vehicle of transmission. So, but what type of stories are predictive of current attitudes across countries? towards trust, altruism, and risk-taking. I'm going to take this as what varies across societies. So, you may think that there are specific stories that may influence the transmission of specific traits. So you tell these stories when you want to instigate norms about trust, or you tell these stories when you want to make your kids more prone or less prone to risk-taking. We don't know. We have no idea of how are these basically, which stories are appropriate for which type of behavior. So what we will do, we'll let the data uncover what list of words are most predictive of current day values. So we're going to aggregate now our indigenous societies folklore at the country level. And so basically this asks for machine learning techniques. So, basically you have many predictors because you have predictors from the Luke dictionary, these psychosocial dictionaries that I explained very briefly earlier, or the Moral Foundation dictionaries. And I'm going to add basically another 10,000 list of words that you can take from ConceptNet. So basically, think that now I have a regression. I'm trying to explain differences in trust across countries. I have data for 70, 90 countries from the World Value Surveys, and I have 11,000 predictors. Okay, that's hard to basically discipline. So we're going to use basically Lasso to get our estimation going. So it's going to give me the most predictive features. What type of stories are mostly predictive of trust across societies? What type of stories are most predictive of risk-taking across societies? What type of stories are most predictive of altruism across societies? So here's what we find. The most predictive type of stories that drive trust are motifs where basically characters give or seek advice. So it is the key word of ConceptNet. In ConceptNet about counseling, stories that are about counseling, seeking and getting advice are basically societies that are high trust today. Norwegians, their folklore is basically, you see here, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark, the ones that we actually associate with very high trust societies. Why on earth are they so high trusting? Our interpretation is because all their stories are about seeking and getting advice. We did not know that. Now we know it. How about how you instigate someone to be of risk-taking behavior? Again, think of this regression that is like you try to explain 75 point differences in the risk-taking across countries. This is from the GPS dataset. What is a key predictor of whether some countries register more higher or low risk-taking is whether you get unexpected as a key word in the motif. So unexpected things happen. This is places where basically you get systematically much higher risk-taking than otherwise. Finally, how about altruism? What type of stories explain or predict differences in altruism across the globe? Again, when you have motifs about controversy, is the key word that is being basically chosen from ConceptNet, you get systematically lower levels of altruism. What are the words that are tagged in the keyword controversy? Dispute, quarrel, contest, conflict, argument, debate. So these are all motifs that the more you have of those, the less likely you are to be altruistic today. So I'm terribly out of time. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, please, Rob.
So I want to object to your intro, which is that there's genes and food and folklore as the mechanisms by which culture gets transmitted. It seems to me we know for sure that's false, because think of grammatical norms. Grammatical norms are never, verbalized at all, yet they persist over thousands, 10,000 years almost. They're what let us, all the groups and those things are being identified by characteristics that are transmitted not through folklore, but by social learning mechanisms of other kinds. And I would think that's quite general. So there are different ways of holding a bowstring. You can use 3 fingers, you can use your thumb. You'll not find, I bet, in a single one of those folk tales, a description of how the hunter is using the bowstring. And yet, that is highly heritably transmitted over long periods of time, whether you use your thumb or use 3 fingers. So, not to say that this doesn't happen, but there's a lot of other stuff going on too.
Absolutely. Of course, I wanted to be provocative, but so I managed. My goal has been reached. Yes. So the deeper question is like what things are being transmitted by oral traditions and what elements are not. And this is basically, so far we have not been thinking about oral traditions being even a mechanism of transmission. Here I'm standing up and saying, look, we have been missing something that perhaps is not trivial, and let's study it much more carefully. So yeah, point well taken.
So thanks an awful lot as someone who deals with many folklore folks in this area. And this brings up a question about evolution. So obviously there's a lot of studies of how certain tales in particular have moved from one part of the world to another. And do you have any evidence in the data set of basically independent origin of motifs versus transmission through space and time?
Very good question. So if you ask Yuri, he will tell you, because he's my to-go man, my understanding of folklore is only evolving. He would tell you that, look, parthenogenesis we cannot rule it out, but think of it as agricultural spreading. And the motif is like a technology, and traders will bring it, wars will bring it, large-scale migration will bring it, and some societies will adopt, and some will not. So that's how basically, that's why the original way of thinking about folklore was to try to get, who was the first guy to tell this story in what location. So, this has been the holy grail of among folklorists to identify the origins of time and space of particular motifs. It's a freaking difficult question, but that's still the mindset that they operate. Yes. So in the data, we cannot tell which motifs have spread or which motifs have been just adopted or they were, found, only indigenously. So.
Yeah, I actually have a quick comment. I worked with his data about 10, 15 years ago. And the idea was actually to trace the spread of humans from Africa. So I was trying to correlate the geographic spread of motifs with different haplotypes, human haplotypes, Y chromosome. But that project didn't go anywhere, but actually you can do the stuff that Yulu mentioned. Yeah.
So just a quick question about hunter-gatherers and leisure. So you say that their folklore is full of stories about dancing, whatever. But who said that what folklore says is what people do? Maybe this is what they want to do? Like our folklore is about like superheroes who are like rich or have superpowers, right? So, I mean, it's definitely not what we normally do. So how do you establish this correlation between... No, seriously. I mean, why do you think that what they have in this folklore is what they were doing instead of what they wanted to do?
So yeah, that's why that's a very good question. It has been bothering me a lot, and my answer is that's why I spend a lot of time thinking about in the first part whether you talk about agriculture, are you a farmer or you're a fisherman? Because if you're a fisherman and you talk about agriculture, then I have a problem. Then really your mindset is about things that you don't have, and they are all deep buried in the oral tradition, so I have a problem. So the fact that on average, characteristics that are observed, you are mostly a farmer, closer to earthquakes, and it's cold, you're going to talk about cold stories, full of shaking dead, and basically growing crops. So this gives me some, again, I cannot tell you that you're not right, but I can tell you that for the other parts for which I observe, there is a positive association between the intensity of a given phenomenon and its respective intensity in the oral tradition. There are certainly cases, what you're saying is very true, but we don't know how to deal with that yet. So, it's kind of the first project. It has many more mistakes than true things, but it happens with most first projects.
We have one last question.
Yes, so this is sort of a clarifying question. Are you including religious stories, like religious text, in folklore? In
yes.
that it seems like that's the other way that oral traditions and stories are passed, and that's a lot of the magnitude. So I was just curious.
Right. So this is again a question for Yuri. He would tell you that look, he's trying to filter out any religious stories for the indigenous societies. The only indigenous society for which the oral tradition is equivalent to the religion, it is the Jews. It is oral tradition and the religion, they are one-to-one. So for basically Jews, the Old Testament is basically the oral tradition of the Jews. For the rest, he would say that I'm trying to filter them out, so that's why there are not many stories about gods. There are not gods in the sense of there will be spirits and demons and evil, but there will not be, saints and things like that in the stories. If you are just to look very briefly about, sainthood, if you think that is a monotheistic thing, there are no saints there. Again, there's much more variation. So if you think that Christianity covers a whole lot of places, there is much more meaningful variation across indigenous societies within the Christian fold or the Muslim fold. But it's very interesting what you say, actually. It's a good question. Thanks, Itzi.